right. Well, great. So as a starting place, right, we know that one of the important consequences of human activities around the planet is that we're seeing many species are being moved all over the place, and we're having increasing problems with exotic and invasive species. And I think that, we're doing a great job in increasing public awareness of the impacts, but a lot of times the awareness has been focused on more charismatic invaders or ones with more obvious impacts. And of course, I have the mute swan in there for those in New York, where that's been a pretty contentious issue recently. And for a lot of people, it's more difficult to really understand the impacts of exotic plants and the threats that they pose to systems, because for many people, it's just not even apparent that they're present in a system. Oftentimes it can look just like regular habitat that's available to wildlife, or that supports other plants. And that's what I'm going to focus on today, is one invasive plant in particular, and that's Amur honeysuckle. Amur honeysuckle was introduced from Asia as an ornamental, but it is spread in a lot of systems, not really every region, but in some places like in Ohio, for example, it has become the dominant understory plant in a lot of forests. I looked up too in the New York invasiveness rank, and honeysuckle does rank as very high invasiveness, so it's a problem here. The impact of honeysuckle on native plant communities has been pretty well demonstrated, especially in terms of the effects on spring ephemerals and on seedlings and saplings of woody plants. And so it's shown it affects not only their distribution and abundance, but also their reproduction. Today I'm going to focus on birds, though, and the group of birds will be understory nesting birds. And so these include northern cardinal, next to that is wood thrush, gray catbird, Acadian flycatcher on that top row, American robin, indigo bunting, and red-eyed vireo are examples of the species I'll be talking about. And this work has been based on mature riparian forests where my students and I have been working for the last 13 years, and these are distributed in and around Columbus, Ohio, along a rural to urban gradient. So we're always working in these forests along rivers, but some of them might be surrounded by agriculture, farmland, and others more by neighborhoods and city types of habitats. So one of the things we found when we first started working in the system is that the likelihood that honeysuckle would dominate the understory of a forest was positively related to urbanization. So the more urban that landscape is surrounding the forest, the more likely honeysuckle was to dominate. And that makes sense, given that it was brought in initially as an ornamental and it's animal dispersed. So that's not a big surprise. And with honeysuckle comes a number of important changes to the ecosystem that we would think should affect birds pretty strongly. One is big changes in habitat. So this is a picture of what the understory of many of these forests look like. It's just a sea of honeysuckle. But we also find that food resources can differ as well, especially fruit resources are an obvious one. And when we look and count all the fruits in these forest habitats during the non-breeding seasons in September and January, honeysuckle is by far the most abundant fruiting plant out there. Honeysuckle also causes some pretty dramatic shifts in the phenology, or the leaf out, and also leaf drop of the forest. So honeysuckle is a very early leafer, so as you go through, like if in a couple of weeks, if you're driving through Columbus, that's the green in the understory is honeysuckle. It's the first thing to leaf out, and it also holds its leaves longer than a lot of other plants. So when we were trying to understand the effects of honeysuckle, we looked across the whole community, but I'll highlight two species that we focused on a little bit more intently in terms of their response. And these are species that represent groups of birds that either avoid or really seem to respond positively or adapt to urban landscapes. So on the top, there's the Acadian flycatcher. This is the species that we would group with other urban avoiders. So here on these graphs, this is showing the abundance on the y-axis, and then the amount of urbanization on the x-axis, going from the negatives are more rural landscapes, the positives are more urban ones. So Acadian flycatchers are more abundant in the rural landscapes and decline with urbanization. Northern cardinals, it's the opposite. They're increasing in number as landscapes become more urbanized. And we believe that honeysuckle might be part of the driver, one of the drivers of these changes in abundance. And that's because we can just look, for one, at the behavior, the settlement behavior and habitat choices of these two species. So you'll recall, right, as urbanization progresses, you have more honeysuckle. But if we look at northern cardinals as an example of a shrub nesting bird, it very strongly is selecting territories in areas where there's more dense vegetation, and especially that exotic vegetation. So right there, it seems that that thick, dense honeysuckle, it just looks like super great habitat for cardinals, and they settle there in higher numbers. And for Acadian flycatcher, it's just the opposite. Acadian flycatchers, flycatch in the understory, so they like a very open understory that's not choked with branches. And so they, as such, are avoiding areas with very high density of understory vegetation. So here you can see their territories have fewer woody stems, less vegetation than randomly located points and stands. So in those two cases show just what we'd expect, right? You change the habitat, and that's going to provoke changes in abundance just based on the kinds of habitats these species prefer. One of the more interesting and unexpected consequences of honeysuckle we found, though, relates to predator-prey interactions. So we found that honeysuckle can actually affect these species interactions at higher trophic levels. These are pictures on the left where we've put cameras up at nests and in order to document the kinds of predators that were taking nests. So you can see a cat on top, American crow, and then I think a Cooper's hawk or something on the last one. And so what we found was that nests that were placed in honeysuckle, and this graph here on the y-axis is daily survival rate of a nest. So, the higher that is, the higher daily survival rate, the more likely that nest will survive across the season. And typically when you get below a 90% daily survival rate, that nest is doomed. So here you can see that light green bar, those are nests placed in honeysuckle. They have a significantly lower survival rate than nests that were placed in native plants. So what we thought initially, my student Kathy and I, was that this was probably due to differences in the architecture of the plant, because honeysuckle, relative to a lot of saplings that would normally be in these forests, starts branching out really low. And so nests are closer to the ground by about 1 meter to 1.5 meters, closer to the ground when they're in honeysuckle than native plants. And we thought it also might affect the distribution of plants across the stand as a whole, because nests in honeysuckle were more likely to be in big patches of honeysuckle. So maybe that was, somehow making it easier for a predator to search for them. So we wanted to then take the next step and to ask, well, then does honeysuckle act as this ecological trap, right, where it's something that looks like great habitat for a species, but because we've modified the system, it no longer is actually functioning as good habitat, and quite to the opposite effect, it's harming the species. They don't survive or reproduce as well. So we suspected this potential for an ecological trap, again, because we know that there was a preference to nest in honeysuckle for many of these understory nesting species. And so what we found was that honeysuckle did seem to be this ecological trap, but we added a word there. We added the word ephemeral because it didn't always act as a trap. So I'll walk you through this graph again. So on the y-axis, once again, we have daily survival rate of nests. But then on the y-axis, we have the Julian date. And so this is, looking at from the very beginning of the season. So for us, that would be for a lot of these cardinals, the end of March, all the way through the end of the season. And so in red, the red line shows how nest survival changes for honeysuckle. So what you can see that nesting in honeysuckle early in the season is just the worst choice understory nesting bird could make. They have very, very low nest success. But later in the season, they actually have much higher nest success, even though they're still nesting in honeysuckle. And this is interesting because, originally when we thought, oh, it's changes in, nest placement, they're closer to the ground. Well, the nest height does not actually change over that season. So it can't be nest height. So we were wondering, and nor does the spatial distribution, of clumps of honeysuckle. And so I guess, we'll talk about that in 1 second. What the next thing I just want to point out is that, some of you who know birds might be thinking, okay, well, nest survival's low, maybe their nests get depredated, but for goodness sakes, cardinals and a lot of these birds re-nest over and over and over. And that's true. We've detected cardinals, we'll monitor them, and they can nest 5 times, during a season or more. So what we did to see if there was a more permanent or reproductive effect truly on them was we have these birds banded, and we'd follow every single nest attempt they made throughout the course of the season. So then at the end, we knew, okay, this pair here produced 3 young birds over all of their nest attempts. And what we found was that cardinals that made their first nest attempt in honeysuckle fledged 20% fewer young across that entire season. So there was this penalty. So even though they could re-nest, if they, honeysuckle leaves out first, they're like all over it, right? They put their nest there, they get hammered by predators, but there's a consequence that persists throughout that entire year that they're fledging fewer young. So why are we finding that? Well, what we think is where we see this difference, this change in the survival rate in honeysuckle, where it's kind of lower than native plants to about the same or higher, it corresponds to a big shift in where nests are placed within that site. So early in the season, and this is before full leaf out of the season, early in the season when you have pretty much it's the understory leafed out and everything else is just budding, we find that almost all of our nests are in exotic plants. And this is across all species because we're monitoring all of our all the species that are breeding in the understory. And so, we have this pretty simple sort of nest placement situation, or they're placed in similar locations, versus later in the season, once the whole forest is leafed out, then you find that most nests are in native plants, right? And as they're in native plants, they're also distributed over a much wider range of heights as well. So not only different species, sort of in different growth forms, but also different heights. And so there is evidence, experimental evidence, many years ago that showed that it's as you have more partitioning of nests, where nests are in very different locations, even the same number of nests placed in different locations is more difficult for a predator to find than if you took the same number of nests and put them all in similar locations. And this makes sense, of course, right? It would be if we're looking for Easter eggs, you put them all at the same height or in the same place. That's going to be much easier for kids to find. And so late season, what we have is that when nests are in these more native plants, they're distributed over this wider, many different places, and they're more difficult for predators to find, is what we think. Versus early in the season, almost all those nests are in the honeysuckle, and they're easier for the predators to search for and to locate because they're in these similar places. So the other thing I wanted to just share with you is some recent work that we've been doing, well, over the last several years, but we were actually trying to test out some of these ideas experimentally. And so we used 4 different urban parks in Columbus, and we established two hectare grids per park. And in one of those that had been randomly chosen, we removed all the honeysuckle. We actually contracted out for someone to cut it, haul it out, chip it up, which was a huge undertaking. And it actually is pretty hard to, the before and after pictures don't really capture it, because you could see in this photo here, you see the honeysuckle in the background. And this is right in the early spring, so it really shows the honeysuckle. And it used to be like that in the foreground, too. So you can imagine taking a pre-shot standing in the middle. It would just be, you know, close-ups of leaves. So this was a huge task to remove all of this honeysuckle. And here are just some other examples just showing the sort of control, the control site versus the removal sites. So one of the things that people always say first is like, well, you know, you've removed everything in the understory, so is it comparable to, I don't know, any natural, what a more native floristic community would look like in these riparian habitats? And so we do think that the experiment did restore more of a typical understory structure for these riparian forests. So you can see here that these rural forests were very similar to the experimental removal sites in terms of the exotic shrubs that were present, native shrubs, you know, a few less saplings, but not hugely different in forb cover. Versus on the control site, where we did not remove honeysuckle, you have huge amounts of the exotic shrubs, and that you have much lower amounts of forbs. So what we found in terms of the changes in the species distribution is what you'd expect then. We found for some understory nesting species like cardinals that if you look pre-removal and post-removal, their numbers declined. And this is density per 2 hectares. And we didn't see similar declines in our sites without removal or our rural sites. The same is true for gray catbird and wood thrush. You know, and that's interesting here with wood thrush because that's a species of conservation concern, right? So it's, some people might say, oh dear, you know, if you're losing that species, but you'll recall it might be, you know, harming them in terms of some of their reproductive success. We only had 2 species that showed significant increases in abundance, and those were downy woodpecker, which, you know, honestly, I still don't know why. I haven't come up with a good explanation for that yet. So I'm curious to hear thoughts you might have. And then indigo bunting. And with indigo bunting there, this is a species that will nest in forbs often, so that increase in forbs might explain their increase in number. And so here we're looking at the daily nest survival rate of birds, of cardinals in this graph over the years in 4 different kinds of sites. So here we've added to the mix. We have the rural forests, the control forests, and those are adjacent to the removal forests. But we also included urban forests sort of away from where we were removing honeysuckle, just in case our removal efforts had influenced predator movements. And so interestingly, what we find, contrary to what we would have expected, was that the removal sites, are this red dashed line at the bottom, had the lowest daily nest survival. So across all of the treatments, nest survival decreased over the years, but it was, lowest in these removal sites. And so, when we found the same thing for robins as well. So it was much lower nest survival in these removal sites. When we look at gray catbird, there's sort of it's this interaction where urban removal sites are kind of intermediate in terms of nest survival rates, but they're the only ones to increase over the years. So it seemed that that was continuing to do better, and we'll see I don't have all the, we're still just proofing a lot of our nest data still, what happens for 2013 and then 2014 to see if that continues to rise. For our two more, quote, sensitive species, Acadian flycatcher, and then you'll see next wood thrush, there we did find that the daily nest survival in urban removal sites was greatest among them. So Acadians seemed to benefit in terms of nest success, as did wood thrush, although we had fewer wood thrush nests. So there with the nest survival, those different patterns, and this is something I've been just now doing a lot of the analyses for, I think that part of what's happening is some density-dependent response from predators, right? Because the ones that we're showing where the urban removal sites had the lowest nest survival are really abundant species, cardinal and robins. So it might be that they're the abundant ones and predators are just focusing on those. They're a bit easier to find because they're still nesting in the remnant shrubs that are low. But our less common species seem to be doing better. So I have a feeling it's some density-dependent response, but I don't know yet. We also did find, too, that predator movements may be affected by the honeysuckle. And so though this didn't really coincide with everything we found, but some, like gray squirrel, were much more active in the control plots, for example, than the removal sites. So over all these studies, and what we found is that honeysuckle not only is changing food resources, habitat structure, but also nest predation. And it can even create an ecological trap for some of these shrub nesting birds, where it diminishes their reproductive success across the entire season. So with that, I know that we wanted to leave some time for questions, and yeah, thanks for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions that I can.